Hello, and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Stephen Saum, and I'm Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California. We'd like to thank Betsy and Roy Eisenhart for sponsoring this Future of Democracy program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest. Cass Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School. He's one of the nation's most cited legal scholars, and his timely new book, Campus Free Speech, a Pocket Guide, addresses the complex issues surrounding the First Amendment on college and university campuses, especially during these polarized times. Before we get started, if you have any questions for Professor Sunstein, please submit them in the YouTube chat, and we'll get to them later in the program. Professor Sunstein, welcome, and congratulations on your new book. Let me start out by asking you about a metaphor that you've used in how you approach this book, coming at it, right? So you're a legal scholar, professor of law, but you talked about working on it as if you were a plumber or a doctor, coming in and addressing the problem of free speech. How so? How can you explain that for our audience?
Yeah, it was an unusual attitude to have for writing. I thought, given all the volume and all the intense feelings, which are completely, I think, to be honored. People deserve to have intense feelings about issues, including the issues that prompted campus protests. What might not be useless was to lower the volume, at least for myself in the writing, and to regard the problems as ones that are manageable if you have a framework, and the First Amendment of the Constitution provides a framework. So if there's something broken in a bathroom, a plumber comes in, and even if people are very unhappy that the thing is broken in the bathroom, you don't want it not to work. The plumber has a tool, and if we're lucky, they can fix it. And if someone has a sore throat, there's a kind of off-the-rack set of things you do if someone has a sore throat, if you're a doctor. And lawyers are like that too, often. If someone has a dispute because, let's say, someone fell on their property and they're suing that person, lawyers kind of know what to do. And with free speech, lawyers can't solve every free speech problem because some of them are novel questions for which there isn't a solution, but there's a whole lot of stuff there that's usable, and I thought that's the toolbox that this book would wield.
So you used the phrase framework, right, as opposed to an algorithm, for being able to say here's how it's all going to work.
Yeah, so that's the kind of disclaimer, but let's be incautious here and say that the disclaimer is fair, but maybe excessive, that we do have an algorithm for most problems if we use our First Amendment. So if someone says, I think communism is great, that's not regulable under the First Amendment. If someone says, I think communism is the worst thing ever and capitalism is terrific, that's not regulable either. If someone says that some dictator, say Castro, had the right idea about things, that's, in my view, not the correct thing to say, but it's protected. If someone says climate change is a hoax and a whole lot of foolishness, that's protected, even though, in my view, that's not true. If someone says we're all going to die because of some environmental problem in short order, that's I think not science-based stuff, but it's protected by the First Amendment. If someone says, let's fix prices, it'd be really good to fix prices. And that's either itself or very much on the way toward a violation of the antitrust laws, and the First Amendment doesn't protect that.
So what would you say, let's kind of start on a big level. What are some of the greatest misperceptions about free speech on campus?
Well, I think one is that incitement as such can be banned. And there was a great federal judge named Learned Hand, an unlikely name, who actually believed incitement as such can be banned. But under the First Amendment, that's not true. So if I go down the street saying, buy my book or there's going to be hell to pay, if you don't buy my book, it's going to be just a terrible thing in your town. There are going to be riots. That maybe is incitement. I could devise the hypothetical such that it is incitement, but it's not regulable. So what we need under the First Amendment is speech that is intended to produce and likely to produce imminent lawless action. We can talk about that, but that's a much narrower category of regulable speech than incitement. I think that's the first. The second misconception is that the First Amendment applies to private universities.
Right.
And this is held even by people who are really amazingly learned about law and life. But if a private university says, I'm going to regulate speech, the First Amendment doesn't apply. California, as it happens, applies the First Amendment to at least a wide range of private universities, but what is applicable to them is the California law, not the First Amendment. The First Amendment kicks in because of California law. If universities in New York or Massachusetts or Mississippi that are private regulate speech, that's okay. And under the First Amendment, I think it's not okay in principle. And so one thing I urge, and this is not being a plumber or doctor, it's being an advocate, is that use of the First Amendment is a really good idea by private universities, but it's not compulsory. There's a lot of confusion out there about hate speech and, racist speech and anti-Semitic speech, and, hate speech is not a category under the First Amendment, and racist speech is in a category, or anti-Semitic speech is in a category. If you go up to someone and say, if I see you here again, your face is going to start to hurt because I'm going to hit you, that's a direct threat, and that's regulable. But if you say something, quite offensive about people, First Amendment protects that. And Oliver Wendell Holmes said, we protect freedom for speech we hate, even for speech we believe to be fraught with death. That's pretty strong language. Mm-hmm. People don't quite get that.
So in addressing, coming back to, say, anti-Semitic speech, and if we're talking about free speech on campus, that was obviously something that was being tackled in hearings before Congress as well, right? Late last year, and then again this year. The lessons from this book, how would those have come into play if they were following the guidelines in the book? How might that have affected how those hearings could have gone?
Okay, so let's start with the First Amendment. So let's assume we're following the First Amendment because we have to. If someone says, I think that men are better at math than women, or I think women can't handle math, someone says that, that's not regulable under the First Amendment. It doesn't fall with any regulable category. If someone says something about race that's similarly, I think terrible, the First Amendment doesn't allow regulation of that. And so too, if someone says something that is taken as anti-Semitic or that actually is anti-Semitic, the First Amendment protects that. And we really do know that because federal courts held that Nazis could march in Skokie, Illinois. And Skokie, Illinois is a place where Nazis have a particularly there isn't a place where Nazis don't have a particularly, but let's just say Skokie is a place where Nazis had a particularly horrific smell. There are Holocaust survivors there. Yeah. So we know that. Now it gets a little trickier, and I'll give two reasons why, and this is the kind of framework rather than algorithm. If students say just in the hall things that are sexist or racist or anti-Semitic, that's not regulable under the First Amendment. But a private university isn't bound by it, so it might say, I will take a stronger stand against racist and sexist anti-Semitic speech than the First Amendment would allow me to take were I a public university. I think that's not a good idea, and we can explore why. But it's an understandable idea. Let's just note that for a university to say, we are a university where we want everyone to feel safe, and therefore, some things follow, that's permissible under the First Amendment. Okay, that's fair, and then we can talk about whether it's a good idea. I think generally not. Then there's something else in play, which is super interesting, which is the law isn't all filled in about whether educational institutions have some leeway under the First Amendment that the government generally doesn't have. So let's suppose a professor says, I think that men are just a lot better than women at math. And you can ratchet it up so that it's more and more, let's say, have a soft word, concerning or objectionable or horrifying. Now, if people say that, the First Amendment doesn't allow that kind of thing to be regulated. But if a math professor says that, a university, even a public university, might say, hey, professor, how are you going to do your job if you're on record as saying that women can't take the course or can't do well in the course? So there's a line of cases involving government employees. This is getting a little technical, but I hope not getting a little uninteresting. It's really interesting, saying that a government employee can be regulated more than a citizen can in order to ensure that the government employee does the job. So if you have someone who's working for the Internal Revenue Service, let's say in a policymaking position, who says, I think taxation is theft and I don't think there should be any tax system at all, we have at least a discussion to be had. If you have an admissions officer who says, I think, and then fill it in with racist, sexist, or anti-Semitic stuff, to do the job of the admissions officer might be hard because the person is on record as not welcoming various people who might not therefore apply to the relevant place. And for universities, our admissions officers have to be kind of with the program of the university and their public statements. That's fair. Or if a, let's say, university administrator says, I've always aspired to do R-rated movies, and that's what I'm going to do over the summer. And the university says to, let's say, the dean of students, we don't really want you in R-rated movies. You're the dean of students, and this is kind of incompatible with what you're doing. It's not clear that the First Amendment forbids that. I'm phrasing this gently. You can design the case so that, of course, a public university could say, we're not going to fire you, but if you're going to be making sexually explicit videos, you're not going to be dean students. That's a position with which that is incompatible. And whatever you think of the particular case, what matters is the direction of the argument. So that's a long-winded way of saying that racist, sexist, anti-Semitic stuff could be, at least for faculty, making it difficult for them to do their jobs. Not because you are thinking people can't have particular points of view, but a history professor who says that, let's say, Jewish students can't understand history or Arab students struggle with history, that's not going to be compatible with them teaching history in the way the university needs history to be taught. That's the general direction. But basically, I'm giving qualifications to the fundamental theme, which is if people say things that other people are hurt by or object to acutely, well, that's freedom, that's pluralism. And as Justice Jackson said in the greatest sentence ever issued by a Supreme Court justice, compulsory unification achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. And we don't want the unanimity of the graveyard, even if people feel with teeming life that those people are full of something worse than nonsense. The university kind of needs that.
And that's right. And that's a quote from the 1940s. And wasn't it a case involving education as well?
Completely. It was about whether people could be compelled to salute the American flag. It's an amazing case. It was in the midst of World War II. It's a 1943 decision. And you might think that in the midst of World War, the Supreme Court would be extremely reluctant to strike down a law requiring people to salute the flag, that patriotism is kind of not just an important thing, but maybe deemed an essential thing for national survival. And the Supreme Court said no, partly because it was thinking that what we're fighting for is people's right to dissent even from a commitment to the American flag. And the atrocities of fascism were very much on the court's view screen. It even referred a little more directly than obliquely to the ongoing war. And I say, if there are people saying things that people regard as objectionable and hurtful and, demeaning, that the presumption should be that's okay, though we can devise cases, especially on the part of authority figures who were rightly asked by the university to do a particular job, even if we can devise cases in which the authority figures can be told, hey, president of the university, if you have some things to say about, race and gender that are horrifying to members of our community, maybe you shouldn't be president of the university. That's probably some version of that is probably fine.
So let's come back to something that you brought up about how you don't think it's a good idea to kind of not apply the First Amendment, essentially, right? A private university where you may have administrators and folks say, this is the kind of community we want to create, and so these things will be okay and these things will not be okay. Why is that a problem?
Okay, so there are two things to be said when you have a hard situation, and I'm going to show my University of Chicago heritage here. One thing to say is, what are the costs of decisions? And another thing is to say, what are the costs of errors? Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to a restaurant and it has 1,000 things on the menu, I might ask the waiter, what do you recommend? Because if I go over everything on the menu, I'll be unable to make a decision until 3 hours into the evening, and then the restaurant will be closed. So you want to minimize, when things are hard, the burdens of decision. And that is kind of a rule that people, I think, intuitively follow in life. I'm going to get to your question. I'm not stalling. I'm going to get to your question momentarily. The other thing to think is, how many mistakes will I make and how bad will they be? So if you think the waiter tends to like a kind of food that you don't like, then asking the waiter, what do you recommend, is not a good question, because you're going to make plenty of mistakes by the standard of your taste buds, because the waiter is going to make a recommendation that you do not enjoy. So you shouldn't do that. Okay, so now let's get to the First Amendment. I say that if you try to build a system of speech regulation from the ground up in 2024, it's going to be really burdensome and really hard. It's going to take a long time. There's going to be a lot of disagreement. It'll be reasonable disagreement. And it might also involve an unpleasant degree of on-the-spot kind of opportunistic gerrymandering. So you're trying to build a system of free speech on the spot. If it's just one person, let's say the president of the university, good luck with that. If it's the president of the university and a committee, a different form of good luck with that. It's going to be hard for them and they're going to disagree with each other. And it may be that what's happening today or this morning is going to have undue weight in your decision making, either because it's just so salient or because someone feels very strongly about how to handle it and it's going to get all messed up. So there's a lot of burden in generating a system of freedom and its restriction on campus that is unlikely to go spectacularly well. If you're lucky, it will, but 2037 might be the year by which you've completed your task. And in the meantime, you need to figure it out. So the First Amendment has off-the-rack stuff. As you say, it's not an algorithm, but for many cases, it gives you, that's the answer, that's the answer, that's the answer. A direct threat can be regulated. Some statement that is hurtful or offensive, that can't be regulated. Something that is a conspiracy to commit a crime, that can be regulated. Something that is kind of upbeat about the idea of civil disobedience, that cannot be regulated. Taking over a building, sure, that can be regulated. Putting down tents in a place where tent putting down is not allowed by neutral restriction, of course, tents can be stopped. So much becomes easy, and that's a virtue. Now, if the First Amendment produced an easy framework that is usable like this afternoon, but the framework's terrible, then we have lots of errors. So if using the First Amendment produced, let's say, protection of speech that clearly should be protected, or allowed regulation of speech that clearly shouldn't be allowed to be regulated, then we wouldn't want to use the First Amendment. And I can see, let's just name two places. This is complicated stuff, so I'm just going to try to make it simple. I can see the Naval Academy saying we're not going to use the First Amendment. We're the Naval Academy. We're military. And, we're trying to prepare people to fight for the country. And the First Amendment standards don't suit us. I think that simple statement is correct, though the Naval Academy, I say, shouldn't run really fast away from the First Amendment. It should start with it and adapt it to its special circumstances, let's say. Second example is Notre Dame. These are two institutions I really admire, Naval Academy and Notre Dame. I've been to both places, and they're incredible. If Notre Dame says, we're Notre Dame, we're not a secular university, we have a particular history, and what we're going to do fits with our history, that's fair. And so for Notre Dame to say, First Amendment's our foundation, maybe, or we like it a lot, but it's not our, we're not all in. That's fair. But for most universities to say we're going to follow the First Amendment, it makes life a whole lot easier. And it also makes life a whole lot better, because the First Amendment system, and here, we're talking about something built up over a period of many decades by Republican judges, Republican nominated judges, probably they are themselves Republican, Democratic judges or Democratic nominated judges, judges of left, right, and center. And of course, they disagree with each other occasionally, but and importantly, but in the main, the framework and the principles are, agreed to by diverse, really smart people over a long period of time, and they've kind of stuck. And so we have something that's super inspiring. It's the envy of the world. And for academic institutions to say, we're not a town, we're an academic institution, which kind of complicates things. But basically, what we love is freedom and pluralism. And what we want safety for is ideas, not for feelings. So if someone says something horrible about the United States, and a lot of people are going to be sad and upset, I confess, horrible things said about the United States made me sad and upset, but that's part of the reason some of us love the United States. That's completely welcome. Or if someone says something about segregation that is approving of aspects of segregation, or maybe approving of segregation, I'll go there. That's part of what freedom authorizes.
So I do have to say, being at St. Mary's in California, since you brought up the Naval Academy, the two schools did face off in the rugby national championship this past year, with St. Mary's coming out on top, so they were happy about that. So we're an academic institution, not a town. You also have in the book you address sometimes you need to fall back on norms as opposed to rules, in terms of how you try and come up with the community that you want. Can you kind of tease that out a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, let me back into that by talking a little bit about our military academies and sports. So I played squash in college, and we played against Army and Navy. And when we went to Navy, we asked, where do we put our valuables? And the students at the Naval Academy, the cadets, said, what? We said, people could steal the valuables. Where should we put them so they're safe? And the cadets said, you're at the Naval Academy. You don't have to worry about things being stolen. We have norms here that are really strong. And so we don't have a place for your valuables. Put them in your locker. Don't lock your locker. It'll be fine. That was interesting. And we'll put that into the First Amendment context in a moment. Also, against both Navy and Army, when we played them, they were in such good shape that they never got tired, because the norm of athletic excellence and ability to run forever was so ingrained that if we went into a fourth or fifth game, we were in big trouble. We had to win quick. So a salute to Army and Navy for basically everything under the sun. Norms. Let's say, I'm going to make up a university, not meaning it doesn't exist, but just randomly give an example at Clemson, which I have not visited, or Tufts, which I have visited. I say there are norms of civility and considerateness and mutual respect that are in the system at Clemson and Tufts. And they aren't necessarily backed by sanctions. So if someone in class is disrespectful, let's just say that the form of disrespect is protected by the First Amendment. There are some forms that wouldn't be because of the context. Let's just say they are. Still, a classmate or a faculty member would give some indication that you violated a norm and that shouldn't be done anymore. Even if the shouldn't be doesn't mean you'll be expelled, it means you shouldn't be. So in a town, and even in New York City, there are forms of behavior which are sanctioned socially, like, butting ahead in line or being discourteous to people, though in New York I've seen that, but even so, there are norms. And on university campuses, there are norms, they're different. So at Notre Dame, there are norms that are different from the norms that are in place, let's say, at Berkeley. Berkeley is a public university, but just they are. But there's an overlap also, that the educational enterprise requires some wait just a sec if you would. So the idea is that in circumstances in which the free speech principle, and notice the claim here is, I say, extremely clarifying for universities all over our country. And this isn't, that I'm not the only one who said this, so it's not an original idea. It's just a not universally held idea. Use the First Amendment, then you're in much better shape than you otherwise would be, and you're going to be so orderly and also free as a result. But there should be norms in place that aren't backed by punishments that will counteract, let's say, some of the pathologies that adherence to the free speech principle authorizes. So if people are saying things that are illogical or unkind or cruel or hurtful, some of those things, a free society needs those things. But some of them a free society doesn't particularly need, and it needs norms that reduce the likelihood that they'll be said.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book is incidental restrictions on free speech, right? Things that free speech is not the main thing that's supposed to be focused on here, but free speech is going to be restricted as a consequence of X. What are some of the key ones of those that especially I think that we've seen over the course of the past year in particular?
Okay, so I'm renting a house as we speak in Washington, D.C. And if I wrote, let's say, in indelible ink on the house, get my book, Washington, D.C., that would be regulable and probably regulated by landlord-tenant law, which, if it's not in the contract, forbids certain forms of mutilation, I'm not sure the right word, of the property. Or if someone drove a car into the house that I'm in right now and said that this is a protest against climate change and about automobile contribution to same. Okay, that's both a horrifying and somewhat ridiculous example. The idea is that the protection of property, both for landlords protected against their tenants and for property owners against automobile crashers is incidentally restrictive of speech. It's not its purpose, as you say, but it does have an effect on speech. So if you say you can't burn your draft card, this is a famous Supreme Court case, the idea that you can't burn your draft card was not intended as a speech restriction. It was intended as you got to have your draft card. And that because people needed to be able to have that and, be able to have evidence of their relationship to the draft. And that was not intended to restrict speech. The existence of an incidental restriction on speech is a potential lawsuit where the people whose speech is restricted can argue that you've prevented me from protesting by burning my draft card. Or we might think of a case where the argument is a lot easier than in the crashing an automobile as a climate change protest, like tents aren't allowed on the property. And I'm going to put a tent up. And the tent is to protest, let's say, something in the Middle East, a non-random example. The analysis of incidental restrictions on speech is similar to the analysis of a content-neutral restriction on speech. And this is all pretty technical law stuff, but it's also intuitive. If you say there can't be loud noises in the dormitory between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., that will prevent protest activity. It's not really an incidental restriction on speech because it's targeting speech. So it's saying everybody has to be quiet. But a content-neutral restriction is viewed much more receptively by the courts under free speech principles than a content-based restriction, which might say, for example, you can't have a protest of the Middle East between 1 and 3 a.m. That would be content-based. So an incidental restriction is viewed in practice even more generously than a content-neutral restriction. You can't have a random one that is clearly inexplicable except as an effort to suppress speech or that doesn't have any purpose to it. But if the incidental restriction has a legitimate neutral purpose, like protection of homes against damage or protection of property against trespass, that's pretty good. And since there are 1,001 and maybe 1,000,001 ways that people who want to protest climate change or want to advertise their books can do that, the restriction doesn't have a, significant negative effect on the ability to get your views across. So too with a restriction on tents, so long as it's not a selective and kind of built on the spot effort to forbid a particular kind of protest, but it's really you're trying to protect the property against people having tents there. That's allowing people who have protests in mind to do a lot of other ways of protesting. They might not believe them to be as effective, but the First Amendment doesn't guarantee you the most effective way of protesting what you don't like.
So one of the members of our audience wants to know, and you've begun to talk about this some, but talk about the three different kinds of restrictions on free speech, and which are okay and which are not likely to be okay.
This is very cool. And one thing that makes it cool is the distinctions I'm about to draw are drawn by the Supreme Court relatively recently. So you can't read this off the founding period. You can't read this off the Civil War. This is relatively recent, but I think it's very, very impressive. So meaning hats off to the Supreme Court justices who developed it. And as noted, this is not an achievement of any particular political group. I think probably justices on the right are somewhat more responsible for it than justices on the left, but they're both on board the basic train. Okay, a viewpoint-based restriction would be one that singles out a particular point of view for punishment. So if you say anti-Semitic speech isn't permitted, that's viewpoint-based because, what the opposite, not anti-Semitic speech is permitted. If you say you can't criticize the president of the university, that's viewpoint-based because it authorizes you to praise the president of the university. If you say you can't speak negatively about the history of the United States with respect to fundamental rights, that would be kind of a crazy law, but we can think of versions of that law that would resonate, I think, in some circles. Viewpoint-based restrictions are very strongly opposed, meaning it's really hard to get one upheld. It's like the strongest presumption against it. We can devise some cases that put a little pressure on the general taboo against viewpoint-based restrictions, but there's a taboo. It's a great taboo, because if a government, let's call it Massachusetts or Mississippi, is favoring one point of view at the exclusion of another, that strikes at the heart of what a system of free expression is about, which is about allowing democratic discussion by all sides. And if you kind of stack the decks by saying one side can't even talk, that's a core free speech Stephen King novel, meaning horror. Not one of Stephen King's elegiac novels. I'm talking about one of his horror novels. Okay, now there are content-based distinctions, if everyone's with me. This is a little law, but every American should know about it, which could be viewpoint neutral. So if you say you can't discuss the Middle East, that doesn't forbid any particular point of view. Or if you say you can't discuss Supreme Court opinions, that doesn't forbid any point of view. Or if you say you can't discuss religion, that doesn't forbid any point of view. It's neutral with respect to point of view, but it's content-based. The Supreme Court doesn't like content-based restrictions either. At times it's said that content-based restrictions are almost always invalid. That's probably a little too strong, but it's ballpark. You can imagine a case maybe where the university, the dean says in a history course, the professors have to talk about history. They can't talk about baseball. That's a content-based restriction. It's okay. But in general, content-based restrictions are strongly disfavored. And there's reason for that also. If you say you can't discuss the Middle East, you can't discuss affirmative action, you can't discuss civil rights, there's a kind of skewing of discussion, which is also at war with the purpose of the First Amendment, which is to allow big issues to be discussed and allow all sides to be heard. Then there's so viewpoint-based, really bad, content-based, bad, content-neutral, maybe okay. The content-neutral restriction might say that wherever you are as listener or viewer right now, that there are going to be restrictions on Taylor Swift concerts between the hours of 3 and 5 in the morning. And everyone loves Taylor Swift. Maybe not everyone after she made a political statement, but everyone loves Taylor Swift as a musician, I hope. Please don't, I'm making a viewpoint-based plea here. Don't criticize Taylor Swift's music. She's really great. But to say that there can't be any music that's loud in the city streets at certain hours, that's in the nature of a time, place, and manner restriction. And the Supreme Court is more hospitable to them. It doesn't mean they're always okay. If you said you can't have loud noises as part of political protests between the hours of 7 a.m. and 6:30 and 7 a.m. one morning and 6:30, it's only 1/2 hour where you can have a loud protest, that would be struck down. But there needs to be a good reason for them. It has to be independent of a desire to suppress speech. And it has to leave open plenty of channels by which people can communicate. So content neutral restrictions are much more likely to be upheld than content-based ones. And universities would do well to keep that in mind, especially when the heat is on to go after one point of view.
So one of the members of the audience wants to know if speech might produce violent actions, is it still protected?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So the word might is where the bodies are buried. So under current law, the general First Amendment principle is that speech that's dangerous can't be regulated. So if there's a possibility that it's going to produce violence, no. if someone writes, let's say, a Marxist tract talking about the exploitation of capitalism and the workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And if it's very provocative stuff, let's say, that might produce violence. It's not regulable. The clear and present danger test says that if speech is intended to incite and likely to incite imminent lawless action, it's regulable. So let's talk about that. Intended, likely, imminent lawless action. So if it's likely to incite lawless action in 3 years, can't be regulated. If it's going to produce lawless action with, let's say, 10% probability, can't be regulated. It's not likely to incite imminent lawless action. So that's the test. Now, on a university setting, even consistent with the First Amendment, my book really struggles with this. I might say as a aside that I don't know if you feel this way or people who are listening feel this way. Often trying to figure something out or writing something down, if that's what you do by your profession or if that's what you just occasionally do, it's really, really fun. And, you know, you're stretching yourself and you're trying to understand something and there's curiosity. Where's this going to go? It's really, really fun. And most of this book had that characteristic. The questioner, I'm very grateful to, because thinking about this is painful. And I think it's productively painful, but it's not a lot of fun. If you think of something that's hateful and with 30% probability, it's going to produce violence that's imminent. Can a public university say, we can't handle a 30% chance of horrific violence? Now, under the Supreme Court standard test, 30% probability appears to be insufficient. Can an educational institution say that we are above all places of peace? Unclear. Or could a private university say, we're kind of with this little book, Campus Free Speech in general, we don't think it's completely foolish, but we're not going to apply the First Amendment voluntarily in that way, in that case. So I think we're dealing with a set of problems that are hard, where the speech with some probability will produce lawless action or violence. If it's over 50%, go for it, ban it. If it's, you know, minuscule, 2%, that's life. If it's 15%, 20%, 30%, that's legitimately a case that reasonable people can differ on, even under the First Amendment. So to say whether in an educational setting, a public university can stop speech that's intended to produce imminent lawless action and that is with, let's say, 35% probability likely to, that's one of those cases that are in an area where reasonable people can keep talking.
So you've talked a number of times about how the Supreme Court in more recent years has actually kind of led us to the understandings that we have about free speech. You know, one, I think it bears underscoring that. So, you know, you're not saying this was it's all there in black and white in the First Amendment as it was understood in the 18th century, and it's been handed down as it is until now. But one of the members of the audience asks about the Supreme Court and trust in the Supreme Court in recent years. You know, maybe connected to the First Amendment and rulings on it, and public trust in general. Is there? Do you think do people have a reason for questioning the fairness, or how can I phrase this? The legitimacy of the decisions connected to the First Amendment that have, say, come down in recent years, given the lack of trust in general in the Supreme Court in recent years?
Well, that's also a really great question. So let's suppose you have a particular set of convictions and the Supreme Court in recent years is not acting consistently with them. and you think on reflection that your convictions are actually the right ones and the Supreme Court is doing something that's not right. That's fair, and that's part of a free society. And sometimes the Supreme Court moves in directions that are compatible with public disapproval. I want to say, and this is, for all of us to see if we agree, that the First Amendment structure is a precious and glorious thing, and it ought not to be thrown into doubt by virtue of recent disputes over, let's say, abortion or presidential immunity. So the system of free expression that I'm talking about, the basic foundations, have been laid over the past roughly 110 years. You can trace it to a general conviction that the founders of the Constitution had, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That's in the Constitution. The structure of specification of what that entails is like a 110-year development. And if you think on reflection that it's terrible, then the idea that universities should adopt it of their own accord would be equally or almost equally terrible. But if we look at what it is, it's not, I think, fairly impugned on the ground that, let's say, the left-wing court of the 1960 period was too left, or the conservative court of the current period is too right. It's a structure that has been built up by extremely diverse people who've converged on these things. Now, the proof is all in the pudding. So here's one thing they've converged on, that if you regulate speech because of its viewpoint, there's some explaining to do. If you regulate speech in a way that's content neutral, we're going to be more receptive. Now, that seems to me a real advance. If someone says to, let's say, their own student or to a classmate, if I see you in my presence soon, your nose is going to be bloody. That's a direct threat. And the Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Kagan, said direct threats, sometimes described as true threats, those can be regulated. It's an old idea. It's also a new idea. It's a good idea. If someone says, by contrast, I think that Ukraine ought to use a lot of military force directly in the heart of Russia, something that's a very controversial statement. That's not regulable. Or if someone says, I think we need to triple the minimum wage, that's not regulable. I think we need to eliminate the minimum wage. That's okay. I think we need to deport, you know where I'm going, or I think we need not to deport. All that, some of those things are very offensive. In the immigration context, some people who are immigrants are deeply offended, and some people who are very concerned about immigration, especially illegal immigration, they're deeply offended. But green light. And here's one way to put it, what the Supreme Court has actually done. Thank you for your indulging this lengthy answer. What the Supreme Court has done that I think is not impugnable by reference to recent controversies is it's seen the First Amendment as a kind of arms control agreement. It said to each side, lay down your arms. So you might be someone who thinks woke is extremely terrible and that the various things that the word woke calls up are hurting our country in significant ways. Or you might think that racism and sexism and homophobia have been defining of our country, and that what's characterized as woke is actually enlightenment, and that we need to prevent aggressions against historically disadvantaged groups. And what the First Amendment says is to all sides, I don't even want to say right and left, all sides, lay down your arms. Let people talk. And your ability to say what you want is solidified by virtue of the fact that you're not going to use arms against people whom you despise when they talk.
So here's a question from the audience, and I'll add something to it. It's asking, if you have any suggestions for how colleges and universities should approach dealing with free speech on campus. One of the things we haven't gotten into yet, but you address is also, and the university itself, the advisability of taking a stand on social issues. And again, I know you're coming from U Chicago, and kind of have some ideas on that. And so can you kind of tackle that on the big level, and then how universities might weigh in to the large conversations?
Okay, so I want to say some issues are really hard. So climate change is really hard. That's my view, and I believe climate change is real. It's not a hoax. It's a very serious problem. What to do about it is difficult. Immigration is a really challenging problem. Whether you're inclined to think one or another view, exactly how to handle it, that's not easy. I'll say that free speech on campus isn't like that. It's much easier. It's not super easy. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's not that easy, but it's not like one of these really hard ones. So what we do is we take our First Amendment and we say we're going to follow our First Amendment. That's our rule. And then we'll say maybe that there are particular cases where the First Amendment's meaning isn't clear. And there are other cases, like maybe for Notre Dame or for West Point, or maybe for universities generally, we're going to depart from the First Amendment for a private university in this way, or we might say we're a public university, we're going to follow the First Amendment, but what that means is reflective of the fact that we have an educational mission, and we can tell our law professors that they're not going to teach Star Wars movies in their law school classes. I say that as a law professor who wrote a book on Star Wars. If my dean wants to tell me, you can't teach Star Wars, you're teaching constitutional law, that's completely legitimate. So the idea is that this needn't be that hard, though there are going to be some hard cases. And we've discussed some of them. I hope we'll discuss others. Okay, on the university, I say, I'm now at Harvard, not the University of Chicago, but I say that the right approach is on public issues. I think the technical term is shut up. For a university to say, we're really worried about immigration, or we think climate change is an existential crisis, or we agree with this side on the Middle East crisis, or we're really mad at Russia, or we're really mad at Israel. All of this would be sophisticated and not just a statement of anger. I say on all that, shut up. And the reason is that the universities is a place of learning. It's a place of diversity. If things are going well, intellectual diversity, the gain of a university weighing in on some issue is extremely modest. It's more expressive rather than doing anything. And the cost is it makes people who are on campus feel excluded and diminished. That's not ideal. It makes some of its own students and faculty feel that they are not with the program. That's not great. The program should be one of learning, not one of we all think this. And it creates a world of trouble with various people inside the university and outside the university, alumni and donors. It brings trouble for the university, and it doesn't contribute. If the university's faculty members have a view, go for it. That's part of freedom. But for the university as such to say, Tulane thinks that Putin is horrible. And I agree, Putin. Sorry, President Putin. I think you're horrible. Forgive me, though he doesn't seem to be a very forgiving person. Wish his family well, wish the people of Russia well, but so that's my view. But I said it note as in my personal capacity. I think universities shouldn't be saying that.
So that, and I should clarify too. I think making the connection with University of Chicago, you include in the book actually a framework that was developed at U Chicago, kind of back from before when you were teaching there, but something to offer for universities, kind of staking out a clear position.
I think it's great. So the Chicago principles I subscribe to. I think we can do better than the actual justification offered by Chicago. If we couldn't, it would be pretty pathetic because what Chicago did was a long time ago. So I think the justification is kind of almost perfect, but not perfect. And there's kind of a hard question which the book, my little book, struggles with, which is, suppose the university is upset not because it has a view on some political issue, but because a political movement is hurting the university itself. So suppose it's not like they have a view, the university, on some Supreme Court decision, but that something that's happening is compromising the integrity of the university. It's targeting the university. The Chicago principles allow the university to speak out to protect itself. It's not like a political actor. It's like a citizen who can say, you're hurting me. And the Chicago says you can do that. I agree with that. And I struggle with the case in which, there's something very extreme and terrible happening. There's a raft of books out recently on Nazi Germany. Maybe there are a raft of books out on Nazi Germany at any point in time, but just noticed there are a bunch of them recently. And if educational institutions in Germany at the time of Hitler's rise were kind of engaged, history would not regard them as unduly active. History would regard them as resisting something horrible. So can we think of a very extreme set of cases where the university should speak out? In the end, I say no, to go in that direction is to create terrible slippery slope problems, and best just to shut up. But people can differ on that. Still, I say self-silencing is the way forward.
So being in Silicon Valley, one of the audience members here, is asking, so now that we're in the era of AI, any thoughts or concerns as it relates to the First Amendment?
It's a great question. So people who are part of Silicon Valley have First Amendment rights to say whatever they want. And I think generally we should celebrate that. Restrictions that would be viewpoint-based or content-based or otherwise based, geography-based, those are completely unacceptable. For Silicon Valley to speak out in ways that are protective of, let's say, the economic interests of the people who are speaking out, that's also completely fine. So for take your favorite or least favorite social media company to say, we don't want any regulation and here's why, and to oppose regulation of AI for companies that are AI friendly, that's completely fine. Some people worry over the relationship between wealth and speech power. I think that's a good thing to worry over. So there are campaign finance cases, which are not the educational environment cases, where the free speech principles are hotly disputed. It's not as if there's a bipartisan agreement that the Supreme Court has gotten it right. And I think the fact that they're hotly disputed attests to the fact that they're hotly disputable. Now, to say that there should be restrictions that ensure that economic inequality doesn't produce political inequality, that's an honorable thought. Whether or not it's right, I tend to think it's right, but it's at least honorable. That wouldn't mean that Silicon Valley as such could be targeted. It wouldn't mean that you could say to someone who runs a big company, you can't talk because you have too big a megaphone. But there's some interesting recent work by some economists worrying over the fact that some people, not only, but including people in Silicon Valley, have such a big megaphone that the democratic process can be distorted. What you do about that, that's a really good question. Nothing is a possible answer, but maybe we can do better.
So you did mention earlier the book that you've done on Star Wars, right? The world according to Star Wars, and there actually is a chapter in there where you address the connection to free speech. Can you let's put those two together now, especially when we were chatting ahead of time, right? We mentioned we just recently lost James Earl Jones, so this seems appropriate. Let's think about Star Wars and free speech and the past and the future.
So the first three Star Wars movie in release order are clearly about an empire and a republic and the struggle between them. It's kind of a romance and an adventure story, first and foremost, and political movies second. But the idea of freedom, including freedom of expression and dissent and orthodoxy, is front and center. So James Earl Jones lifts up a guy who's kind of a dissenter or a weakling or something and kind of chokes him to death. And that's a reflection of authoritarianism and compulsory unification of opinion, achieving the unanimity of the graveyard. Justice Jackson said that something like those who exterminate dissent find themselves exterminating dissenters. That's kind of there in the first three Star Wars movies. The prequels, the underrated and fantastic prequels, okay, they're not that great, but they're amazing in their own way. They're much more explicitly on this theme where the political vision that the incredible George Lucas has is of how democracy dies, to thunderous applause. And the idea is that the quest for, let's say, order and for strength can be destruction of liberty and freedom of speech. Padme, I might be losing some people who aren't really Star Wars aficionados, but Padme is very worried about Anakin, who becomes Darth Vader, as he goes in the authoritarian direction. Padme, a kind of quiet, Natalie Portman, one of the world's greatest actors. Natalie Portman, who has been incredible in so many things, was very good in a hard role in the prequels, and she was the kind of quiet voice of let's preserve liberty. She didn't win, so the fascists won in the prequels.
I know we're just about out of time. I'm wondering, let's kind of tackle this as a two-parter, right? that where they go together, the light side and the dark side. So what with the First Amendment, and especially we're coming back to free speech on campus, the First Amendment more broadly. So what gives you hope and what keeps you up at night?
I'm an optimist by nature, and one reason is that I learned from a behavioral psychologist who said that it's rational to be an optimist, because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice. Once when the bad thing happens, and once when you think about it in your pessimism. So I am an optimist, but I'm more an optimist because I think our country, at least in this domain, freedom of speech, is a shining beacon internally and to the world. What keeps me up at night, I confess, nothing really keeps me up at night except that there's this great show called Slow Horses on Apple, which is really good at kind of riveting. And if I'm not watching it after 10:30 p.m., I start to think, why am I not watching it? It's really good. And that keeps me up at night.
All right. Well, I think we have time for just one last question here. So if you were to give one piece of advice to someone tackling free speech on campus, right? What would it be?
Follow the First Amendment! Exclamation point.
All right. Well, on that note, let me express our thanks to Cass Sunstein, author of Campus Free Speech, A Pocket Guide, and to Betsy and Roy Eisenhart for supporting this program. And we encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Professor Sunstein's new book at your local bookstore. And if you'd like to support more or watch more programs as well with the Commonwealth Club and support our efforts at making virtual and in-person programming available, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Stephen Saum. Thank you very much and take care.